Today we'll cycle back to the virtue of humility, and we'll look at a work that is a recent 2012 work by John M. Cooper, who we've discussed on the blog on several occasions. And Cooper is a professor at Princeton who's specialized in ancient philosophy for, I think, at least some 20, 30 years. Principally, I think, Plato and Aristotle, but also some of the other ancient philosophers. And in his preface to the work we're going to look at today, Pursuits of Wisdom, 6 Ancient Philosophies as Ways of Life, he talks about the fact that he has thought that ancient philosophy now is one of the few areas where philosophy is sort of done in a way that can provide sort of a way of life to be actually literally lived. And to talk about Cooper's 6 ancient philosophies as ways of life, we have to first understand what he means by an ancient philosophy as a way of life. The 6 that he discusses are the Socratic, Aristotelian, Epicurean, Stoic, Skeptic, and late Platonist in the form of Plotinus philosophy. And all of these 6 different philosophies Cooper views as essentially forms of ancient philosophy that can literally be lived, that can literally form what he calls sort of the guiding pilot or steer for all of one's actions, all throughout one's life. And to understand again what Cooper means by ancient philosophy as a way of life, I think it's the easiest way is to show what he doesn't mean. And Cooper talks about this in his preface, where he says one can engage in sort of abstract philosophical problem solving or contemplation that in no way affects how you live your life. And he says much of modern or contemporary philosophy has really no, and I'm quoting him here, has no direct connections to the conduct of life. You can enjoy doing it, you can be very good at it, this kind of philosophical contemplation. But at the end of the day, it's just philosophy, and it's not lived, it's not made a part of your life, and it has no effect on how you're living. But Cooper's whole work is devoted to an examination of philosophies that have their contrary effect. These philosophies do not end at speculation, but these are literally philosophies that are lived. And although the 6 philosophies that Cooper presents in his book are fundamentally different in conclusions they reach as to philosophical truths, or what is good for man, or what's the best way to live, what wisdom consists of, what truth consists of, what beauty consists of. All of these things these questions are not uniformly answered by these 6 ancient philosophies as ways of life. But Cooper stresses that although the answers may be different, what is common to these philosophies as a way of life is the use of human reason correctly in a way that one gets a complete and refined and accurate humanly possible conception of what is good for man, what is of value in human life and its precise value, the nature of the world and man's proper place in the world. And once that sort of rational conception has been correctly extended and amplified and made complete, then one is further ready to defend these conceptions of human life and human goods and the value of human goods and the way to live against all possible objections. And at that point, either the objections are no good, or they're successfully defended against, or the objections point out certain weaknesses in the ideas, and the ideas are further refined based on the objections and what's learned from the objections. But once that whole process is done, then one literally lives this kind of philosophy, because one has use one's reason to develop a sort of a comprehensive view of human good and human nature and the value of all good things, and then has defended against all objections, rational or otherwise, and has come to sort of a complete view of what is good for man and what is good in human life. And then the philosophy at that point becomes sort of a motivational guide, a motivational steer. Literally is lived, because it would be literally absurd not to live one's life at that point in that way. One has already come up with, one's used one's reason persistently, honestly, laboriously to come up with truths, has defended them against various objections, and so it would be absurd at that point not to live a life that is consistent with one has come up with as ideas of what is good for man. And so, while all of these philosophies, the 6 philosophies that Cooper talks about, differ again in their particular views, what's common is that conception of philosophy as a way of life. And Cooper talks of sort of a seamless connection between one's philosophical speculation and refinement of that speculation, and then the actions that would be motivated by that sort of speculation. In this regard, Cooper, I think, importantly points out that any sort of philosophical texts or arguments from others can be relied upon, can be important in one's own philosophical ideas, but they should not be sort of used as a crutch. We should always understand what those ideas mean, and only after we have fully understood them and been able to defend them against attack, can we then credibly live that kind of life in accordance with that philosophy. So the text, so we can't just say, Aristotle says, contemplation is the highest human happiness. Aristotle said that. Aristotle was a really smart guy, and he must have thought about this stuff endlessly, and therefore Aristotle's right, and I'm just going to go with what he says. That's not the right way to do, for Cooper, ancient philosophy is a way of life. We can believe that what Aristotle said was true, but only after we've fully understood it and can defend any reasons Aristotle gives for why that's true, in addition to any reasons we may have, in addition to what Aristotle did not say. And so again, reason is the fundamental anchor for these forms of life. Today we have many people I think have a certain philosophy of life, a certain conception of the universe, a certain philosophy that they try to informal philosophy of life, but they don't feel the need. I don't think it's common for people to feel the need to rationally defend and articulate that philosophy in any sort of detail. As long as they feel it to be true and genuine, for them that's good enough. And so this is not what Cooper means by ancient philosophies as a way of life. This other sort of philosophy as a way of life, sort of more common today, it may have its own benefits, but it's not what Cooper is talking about. Again, for ancient philosophy as a way of life that Cooper will talk about through various philosophies that we discuss, again, always the conceptions formed as to human life and human good and human nature and the value of particular goods must be always rationally articulable, strong and defensible against all proper objections. And that is not something one typically sees in various sort of modern viewpoints or modern philosophies as a way of life, whether that takes the form of certain spiritualized practices or certain other sort of lifestyles that one hears about. They are committed. People can have very strong commitments to them, but it's not fundamentally a rational commitment. And so the first way of life that Cooper presents and we'll talk about is the Socratic way of life. And that is contrasted with Plato's own views, but Cooper presents the Socratic way of life first. And the Socratic way of life, and these are Cooper's views on the Socratic way of life, not necessarily Cooper's own views. And the Socratic way of life, according to Cooper, is fundamentally a life that at bottom is one of humble, very humble inquiry in search of the truth. This is a form of life that has sort of a limitless, endless, lifelong, essential questioning about what is true and good for man, that is committed to refining and strengthening and modifying ideas about what the human virtues are and what's good for a human being. It's a life that fundamentally believes that no human being will ever have sort of a complete grasp of all truth about all human values and all human good. Only sort of a divine creature could have that sort of complete understanding, because the divine faculties, our divine mental faculties, are much more comprehensive, much less prone to error, much less subject to human passions, much more rigorously logical, much more rigorously complete than any human. Even the most perfected, rational creature will still be subject, according to this sort of Socratic view, to normal human mental biases, normal human mental limits, that just puts a sort of a finite point on how much wisdom anyone can attain. And because of that, because no human being will have sort of that godlike wisdom about human values and human life and what's good for man, that humility is an essential attribute of this form of life. It's a recognition that men can only pursue wisdom, men can only strive after it, labor after it, but they can never completely attain it. So this sort of view of philosophy as a way of life views philosophy as a central activity that sort of continues to refine ideas and improve ideas, but totally rejects final truths, final solutions, any sort of final proclaimment of truth that's sort of been worked out and will be forever written in stone, sort of for forever, just to be followed endlessly and without further thought and discussion and contemplation. And so man's knowledge, again, will always be incomplete, but always can get better. So there's this duality within the Socratic form of life, the Socratic humility as a form of life, that yes, godlike wisdom is impossible, but man can continue to push and strive to reach that state as much as possible, but must of course keep the humility of rejecting final solutions, because he fundamentally knows there are limitations on human knowledge. Now, of course, any sort of philosophy or any sort of view of human life cannot well, let's try it. Let me take this back. Now, while the Socratic philosophy as a way of life rejected dogmatism and final solutions, was always open to revision, it still was a life that was committed in the here and now to just, courageous, temperate, and pious actions, Cooper says. The person that is committed to this life does not just sit there sort of endlessly contemplating all day, doing nothing in the world while people are suffering in the world, doesn't do anything to help other people, doesn't do anything to help his family, doesn't do anything to care about his friends. He just continues to contemplate because he doesn't quite know what is good about human affairs, what's good about human values, and so therefore he does nothing. And Cooper rejects that view of Socratic philosophy as a way of life. The person still acts in the world. He's committed to what Cooper says is just, courageous, temperate, and pious actions. A person it doesn't just sit there contemplating. A person acts in accordance with his beliefs during the period that he still remains open to revision of these beliefs. And I think in this regard, it's important to read a quote that we had discussed about almost a year ago on the blog, which was included within Alexander Nehamas's book, The Art of Living Well. And this quote is a quote from Immanuel Kant in his philosophical encyclopedia. And Kant says here, when will you begin to live virtuously? Plato asked an old man who was telling him that he was attending a series of lectures on virtue. one must not just speculate forever. One must one day also think about actual practice. So in this quote again, we see that Socratic philosophy is not one of waiting till one's very old age to just begin at that point, attending another series of lectures on virtue, and still not having actually practiced any of the virtues because of this humility. But again, it's one of one living one's philosophy out in action, while still one remains open to various objections and various refinements of these ideas. Now, even the humblest of life, one would have to say, even the most humbly committed person, this person that's committed to humility above all, must still have, one would think, one or two core commitments in human life. One human being simply cannot live without any commitment to anything, with sort of every single commitment being very tentatively held. And I think for Socrates, and Cooper doesn't quite make this argument, I think he's almost suggests it, or almost would be willing to agree with it, but he doesn't make the argument specifically. But in any event, for Socrates, I think there was one dogmatic belief that he was not open to being humble about, or being open to sort of endless doubt or revision. And that one truth, I think, was the Socratic belief that what mattered, the condition of your soul, and we'll talk about, again, I think what Plato meant by soul, because the modern definition is somewhat different. But the good condition of your soul for Plato, which he defined as that state whereby you are sort of continually attaining wisdom and acting based on that wisdom in very virtuous ways. So it's kind of both things together. The good condition of your soul dwarfs the importance of any and all other matters in your life. Any and all matters. And I think for Plato, the soul was conceived of as basically, we could think of it now as one sort of personality, one sort of essence or being, one sort of a character one could think of, sort of something that remains with us on sort of more than a day-to-day basis, sort of not sort of the moods or what we do on a day-to-day basis, but something that sort of it's a combination of really everything we are, and it's sort of encompassed in modern sort of terms like personality and character. I'm not sure there's any other careful way I could describe it, but it's fundamentally those attributes. It's not at all limited to our physical body or what we do on a daily basis, but it's something that we've created, a sort of being that we've created through many actions over many years in the world, and all what we believe about the world and believe about ourselves. These things all comprise what I think Plato thought of as a human soul. And I want to read Cooper's very elegant formulation of this argument that with the one argument, I think, in Socratic philosophy that is sort of least open to sort of doubt as to whether it is this view itself is could be wrong. And this is a fairly long passage, but very important, so I'll read the whole thing. For Socrates, the soul is vastly more important than any of the other valuable things mentioned above. Indeed, so vastly so that it makes them not just pale by comparison, but in their value totally dependent upon it. When your soul is in its good condition, you have something of unconditional value, Socrates claims. Whereas all other goods, money, pleasure, good relationships with others, power over them, whatever it might be, are only conditionally good. Their value depends on how they are used, how they fit, how they are to fit in your life. They are dependent as goods upon and make a positive contribution to our lives only because of what we ourselves make of them, how we regard them, how we react to having or lacking them, and what we do with them. That is because the soul is that which we live our active lives. Our assessments of value, our decisions, our desires, our choices, all these depend on it. So long as the soul is in its good condition, which Socrates calls its virtue, we will live well, because if we have this most importantly valuable thing in good condition, all other potential or commonly agreed values, wealth, health, good social connections, even bodily pleasure, become actually valuable for us. With a good, well-conditioned soul, we can make proper and good use of these other valuable things and so live good lives. With a bad soul, we will have bad desires, make bad choices, misvalue and misuse such other potential goods, and as a result make a bad life for ourselves. Moreover, for Socrates, this good condition of the soul is ultimately entirely a matter of developing and maintaining a firm grasp on, a firm understanding of fundamental truths about human nature, and as a consequence of that, about the nature of what is valuable for a human being. The good condition of the soul is, in his terminology, wisdom. So, I think this is a point that we've been bringing out on our many other posts on Plato and Socrates, which is, again, that the condition of the soul is supreme and it consists of wisdom. Every other thing, every other sort of external good, every other wealth, health, as Cooper was saying, bodily pleasures, certain relationships in our life, all of those things they're not bad, but their goodness derives in some way, shape, or form from strengthening our soul and making our soul better. They don't have sort of high independent value in and of themselves. Someone could have many different, much wealth, many bodily pleasures, many social relationships, but again, if their soul is in a bad state, if their soul is sort of corrupted, if their soul is not functioning properly, they can't make good use of those things, and because these things, like money, for example, doesn't have intrinsic goodness, money can't be eaten. Money doesn't. You can't sort of sleep on money, or you can't eat money. It doesn't have that sort of use that is intrinsically good, but it's instrumentally good for other things. So all of these things can be used in a way that adds to the health of the soul. But if the condition of the soul is above all other things important under the Socratic way of life, and that is the thing, because it's most important, that is the thing that in the Socratic way of life must be pursued above all other things. It would not make sense under the Socratic way of life for someone to spend most or even a large percentage of their time devoted to these other things, because they pale in comparison to the goods of the soul. And so even we see in Socratic philosophy that praises or endlessly praises humility, there is sort of this one conception that I think is pretty dogmatically held. So, to sum up now, the Socratic philosophy as a way of life is one which prizes the good condition of the soul above all others. It defines that good condition as one where the soul has wisdom, is pursuing wisdom endlessly, and but disclaims sort of dogmatism and sort of continually searches for refinements on whatever wisdom one has, in terms of amplifications and extensions of one's wisdom, responding to objections, incorporating other material, and searching for other ideas, and those kinds of things, and that kind of activity. And so a person must always be open to better solutions and better truths while still continuing in the search. And I think a philosopher by the name of Rick Roderick, who I used to listen to a few years ago, summed this all up very well when he said that he was growing up in West Texas, and as he was growing up in his childhood and adolescence, he looked around and he realized that people around him had very crazy ideas of the world and what was good for human beings. I'll take this inside. Okay, I'll take it inside. Let's go right here. Sorry about that. My gardener came, so I'm going to put this here. One second. Okay, so I think we were getting there. And so, let's see where I was here. I was talking about Roderick, and he said that he had heard all these weird ideas about the world, and people had very strange ideas. He always came up with his own ideas, and he believed in sort of questioning people, and became convinced that their ideas were very strange and nutty, I think he said. But he developed his own ideas over many years. He thought his ideas were good, and he lived his life according to them. But he said that he was always willing to listen to better solutions, to better ideas. But he had not heard of one. He had always been open to other ideas, and always remained open to that, but never sort of ever attained such an idea or heard of such an idea. So I think that's a good way of, again, summing up the Socratic philosophy as a way of life. And one last point, while Cooper kind of stresses this, while final solutions are impossible, while under the Socratic philosophy, that every sort of forward step in a path to knowledge brings some sort of improvement in the person's life, the person committed to this kind of life. There's sort of every sort of bit of knowledge about virtue that we learn and that we actually live makes some contribution to our life, even as we continue to remain open to knowing everything about the world and about human values. So how good really is this Socratic philosophy as a way of life, as sort of Cooper's presented it? I think it's got some good attributes and some maybe not so good attributes. I think it strikes a good balance between sort of action in the world and refinement of ideas and acting based on sort of rationally worked out ideas of what's good about human life. I think it's generally good to be open to the prospect that one could be wrong, if for no other reason than that many very smart people have been wrong on many things, not just philosophers, but scientists, economists, politicians, across almost every area of life, so-called experts, and I think we saw this in Kahneman, and I think we'll continue to see this in Kahneman's work, Daniel Kahneman, have been wrong on some very wrong in big ways about ideas they held on to for very long periods and very strongly. So I think humility, and this sort of Socratic humility, is very important. And I think, and to that extent, this way of life has definitely an appeal. I think the focus on reason as sort of a fundamental tool for self-improvement is also seems to be a good bet too. There's no other human faculty, it seems, that is as well tuned to help us sort of improve our mental understanding if we do it correctly, if we engage in the activity correctly of the world, of what's of value to us, and can help us make sort of necessary corrections as we sort of realize the error of our ways. There's really no other faculty that I think can quite match reason's power in terms of self-improvement. And I think abandoning reason and giving up reason as this fundamental tool for self-improvement means you typically either do what feels right at the moment, or you just do whatever you've been brought up to do, or what everyone else is doing around you. And to the extent you can make, to the extent any of those are wrong, what you feel at the right time might be not what's good for you. We all know that can happen. And when doing what everyone else is doing, we all know that can create a lot of problems for us. And so you can make huge mistakes if you abandon reason, I think, across multiple areas of human life, if you only act based on what feels right or what other people are doing, imitation of others. On the other hand, I think the Socratic philosophy as a way of life has certain deficiencies that need to be considered very carefully. One is the issue of marginal utility, an economics concept that basically says at some point after you start working in an area, you get to a point where further effort, further pursuit of something only yields marginal increases in the value of the thing. So, for example, in this scenario, let's say after 5 years you've made vast improvements in human wisdom and what you've learned, then maybe do you really need a lifelong, earnest pursuit of wisdom to further refine your ideas? Maybe you will continue to further refine your ideas, but you'll do so in only marginal ways that make only a marginal benefit in your life. So in this sense, if you do philosophy for, let's say, 4 or 2 or 3 or 5 years, you do it very earnestly, and you sort of form 90% of the ideas that are going to be of use to you in a human life, does it really make sense to devote them so much of your time for the rest of your life to philosophy and to refining that last 10% where there may be doubt, or to making small improvements in your ideas? I'm not sure that either Cooper or the Socratic philosophy as a way of life have dealt very seriously with this problem of marginal utility, particularly when, beyond human wisdom, there are so many other goods in life, as we've been talking about. Wisdom is, of course, a great thing. Human values and human virtues are great things. But there just seems to be things outside of the human values and human virtues that are good as well. And so we have, given sort of temporal limitations on human life and the problem of marginal utility, I'm not sure that Socratic philosophy as a way of life has answered that objection, or can answer that objection. Another problem with this sort of philosophy as a way of life is that there's no discussion whatsoever of the value of human creativity. Socrates, Plato, in praising reason and discovering the forms and things that have already been established by other people as true about human affairs and human life. Of course, we can contribute in our own ways, but fundamentally it's a working of reason. And I think Socrates and Plato leave themselves open for a devastating attack on this dimension by not discussing the value of human creativity. And I think Nietzsche primarily was the one who jumped all over this and endlessly celebrated man's creativity as being one of the best things about human nature, about human creativity, and denigrating or downplaying the effect of reason or the goodness of reason vis-a-vis human creativity. And of course, I think to that extent Nietzsche was right when he says, or Nietzsche or anyone else that prizes creativity, that man can produce things that are based on his creativity that are not necessarily rational, but are very truly good in and of themselves. They have a fundamental value that cannot be measured by their rationality. The creativity of man, a wonderful painting, a great story, works of literature, these things can all communicate certain truths and be very valuable and good for people. But the Socratic, what philosophy is a way of life, by praising reason so much, does not at all seem to give a real due regard. Maybe it's included in there somewhere, but it doesn't seem to give a due regard for man's creativity and the goodness of creativity. Finally, Socratic philosophy is a way of life, although it says we should fundamentally act in the world based on our conceptions, still does seem to have doubt as one of the lifelong conditions of this form of life. And the Socratic person is never really sure that they're right, always sort of endlessly debating whether he or she may be right. Has he thought of that last objection? Has he thought of that last counter-argument that could be made? And I'm not sure from the perspective of human goodness whether that kind of doubt for an entire life is a good thing. Is it good for a human being to perpetually live in a state of that doubt? I don't think there's really much evidence that it's good for people beyond sort of the qualities needed to produce great philosophy and great academic philosophy. I'm not sure it's at all been proven that the human being, it's good for a man, or it's good for a human to live their life fundamentally always in a state of doubt. I'm not at all sure that's true, and I'm not at all sure that even the Socratic philosophy's injunction that we continue to act in the world based on our conceptions, tentative as they may be, quite resolves the whole issue. It seems to be that there would be some guardedness in one's action, there would be some hesitancy if one is not really sure and still in a state of doubt as to whether one's views are right. So I think in general, though, just mental doubt, mental condition of doubt as to what's good in the world as a lifelong state, not as a year or 2 years or 3 years, as a lifelong state of being. I'm not sure that Plato or Socrates or Cooper or anyone else has proved that this is actually good for human being over a course of a human life. And so Socratic humility in general is an approach that I think has some very good approaches, some good things that it can teach us, but I think it needs some further refinement and corrections, and hopefully maybe we'll get that in the other philosophies as ways of life, which we'll focus on. I think intellectual humility in general is a virtue that's likely to be important, but I'm not sure that it should be prized above everything else as the most supremely valuable thing. And we'll continue looking at this in the other post. Thank you.